Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are looking at Botvinnik versus Capablanca from 1938. Botvinnik, the 6th world champion, has the white side, and Capablanca, the 3rd world champion, has the black pieces. So white opens with d4, the queen's pawn opening, and black responds with the nimzo. White plays a very confrontational variation, immediately putting pressure towards this bishop, forcing it to make a decision. It chooses to take the knight and ruin the pawn structure here a little bit for white. And from here, white continues developing their pieces, knight to e2. Now, one thing you should notice, this bishop is super strong, the strongest minor piece that white has, because it's on a light square. Notice the pawns are on a dark square for white, and therefore the bishop has full scope on both sides of the board. For this reason, black decides to initiate a plan to trade off the bishops on the light square. So they play b6, with the immediate idea of going bishop a6 next and trading the very strong white bishop for the black bishop that wasn't particularly impressive. Now, white needs to accept this trade. If they try to insist on keeping the bishop on the board, the issue is by doing so, you've also allowed this bishop to now control a very strong diagonal, pinning the knight, and so it's not actually going to be advantageous for you to keep the bishops on the board. White decides to trade. Now, what they get in exchange, though, the knight here is a little bit misplaced. It's going to have to spend some time rerouting later in the game to a more effective position, and now white needs to solve a second problem for them. What do you do about this bishop? Because this is the bad bishop in these sort of structures. All of the pawns are prohibiting the bishop from having a successful future. So what do you do? Well, there's two approaches. One is to keep the bishop sort of on this side of the board, the queen side. Often a4 is a move to put the bishop on a3 and just kind of keep it posted away here. It's not very effective, but it could be worse for sure. Now, the alternative idea is to play the move, go for the move e4, and open up the bishop and place it either on f4 or g5, maybe e3, and develop it towards this diagonal. Now, that is not very practical here because preparing a move like e4 comes with a lot of risk. If you play the move f3 trying to go for e4, they're going to shut that idea down. Queen e7. You're never playing e4. It's well guarded. And in the meantime, you've created a very serious weakness on e3. Now you can't even develop the bishop on the other diagonal because you hang the pawn. So the plan to go with e4 is just not very effective here. White decides to instead go for the second plan, put the bishop, tuck it nicely on the queen side, and later maybe it will get a more brighter future. So queen to d7, and we have a4. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier. The main idea is to put the bishop at some point on this diagonal, or at least keep that idea in mind, because one thing you should notice, there's a lot of tension here in the center, and either black is going to take the pawn or push. Either way, this diagonal is opening up, and if they don't do anything, we can take, and again, there's going to be some purpose for the bishop on a3. So a4, very strong, grabbing some space, but also keeping in mind the ideas for this bishop later on. We have rook to e8 and queen to d3, sort of taking place of the bishop earlier, very strong on this square. c4, obviously defending the knight, kicking away the queen. The queen moves to c2, and here black plays knight to b8, going for a very long plan. So, like I said, the one downside here for black is this knight being misplaced. And putting the knight on c7 was not very appealing here for Capablanca. He did not feel that the knight was doing enough. He was very ambitious. He wanted to bring the knight all the way to the queen side outpost on b3. At that point, it would be a very strong piece, sure, but at what cost? It's taking a lot of time to do this plan, and therefore, the earlier idea that I mentioned of going for e4, it did not work earlier because black could very simply stop it, and white did not have enough tempos to make it work. Well, now it actually will work because black has committed to such a long plan. And so, quickly, white recognizes this and switches their pieces towards the center. They're going for f3, they're going for e4. Black can play with this knight all they want on the queen side. We're striking in the center. That's the mindset that Botvinnik had, and it was a very effective one because indeed, once e4 is played, the momentum begins to shift. White begins to maintain some sort of initiative, right? You have ideas of going for e5, starting a kingside attack. This is getting a little bit dangerous. Black needs to be careful. Now, black takes the pawn on a4. They're up material now. Seems good. But then the move e5 is played. The knight moves. And here queen to f2. Again, white is slowly shifting their pieces towards the king side, beginning to hint at an attack that could follow. Now, the move g6 was played so that the knight does not have any very effective squares. You can certainly imagine if the knight teams up with the queen, that could be deadly. So g6 trying to put a stop to that. But now f4, we're going to use this pawn as a hook. The threat immediately is f5. If you do nothing, let's say you just develop your rook, ignore this threat, game over. I mean, there's nothing you could do at this point. We're crashing through. Either the f file is opening, the e file could open as well. You could go for e6 in these sort of positions and kind of open up both of these files. It's over. If rook takes, obviously, queen f7 is the idea. You're picking up the rook. So this is a very dangerous position. Black needs to be super careful, and they play very precisely f5. The only way to stop the move f5, the threat here for white, is to play f5 from black. And here, white was at a little bit of a dilemma, because the position's very closed, and even though you have a nice passed pawn, you have some nice positional bonuses, that pawn's gonna be blockaded by the knight, and in the meantime, you're down material. So you need to go for the attack at all costs. And while the position maintains kind of this locked nature, that's not gonna happen. So they take en passant here. They had to open everything up. And even though that might initiate some trades, which is not necessarily what white wants to do if they're looking to attack, it was a necessary step so that the attack could have a chance of working. So knight takes f6, and here f5, still crashing through and opening up the f file. Rook takes, indeed, we had the trade of the rooks, and rook e8 trying to trade even more pieces off the board. And rook e6, very smart. You're putting pressure on the knight. If the knight moves, there might be some pressure on g6. And if black insists on the trade that they were hoping for, the difference is we now have a very nice and lucrative pawn here on e6 that could be very fruitful in the future. I mean, you can imagine this pawn is a constant threat that black needs to keep in mind. It's just very tiring to always look at it. So the queen, in fact, after king to g7 defending the knight, the queen dropped all the way back to ensure that this pawn is not promoting. And here queen to e5 was played, centralizing the queen, pinning the knight, and defending the pawn. Okay, now one thing that I do want you to begin to notice is what are the effective pieces here for white. So the queen, obviously, super strong. This pawn, a very nice piece, super important. This knight could have certainly a future. It could reroute kind of more passively, or more directly, there's ideas of going knight f5 or knight h5, sacrificing the knight. In fact, that might be a little bit foreshadowing. You'll see this idea come up a little later in the game. The point is these three pieces have direct futures. The bishop on b2, not so much, right? The bishop here might as well be a pawn. It's not adding any value to the attack. So after queen to e7 was played, blockading the pawn, not letting it push forward, white, indeed, Botvinnik, realized how dispensable this bishop is, how it really does not add anything to the white position, and he decided to sacrifice it completely. Bishop a3. And after the queen takes, of course, what was the idea? Well, it was distracting this valuable defender from the pressure that the knight, the queen, and the pawn can impose on the black side. So what was the follow-up? Knight h5 check, sacrificing the other piece, but after the pawn takes, there's queen g5 and queen f6. So you're winning the piece back. However, you still need to have a lot of courage to go for this, because after e7, yes, you are threatening checkmate, but look at your king. It's not very safe, especially because the queen has direct access to what seems like it could potentially be perpetual checks. So what does black do? They go for the check. However, in this position, Botvinnik did indeed see that the king could escape. And so he indeed took the pawn on h5, and then using his own pawns, he played g4, stopping the check, and after queen to e1, king to h5, there were no more checks, and mate is threatened, there's no way to stop it, black resigned. So super interesting game. You saw, first of all, the two takeaways, Number one, this bishop here served absolutely no purpose, so don't hesitate to throw it away if there's a very specific objective that you're gaining by throwing it away, right? It might as well be a pawn, so let's get rid of it to distract the queen and initiate a very deadly attack. The second thing that I would sort of take away here is that perpetual check is not always as convincing as it may seem. So like here, it looks like the king is just wide open and there's going to be, some series of checks, maybe even the knight can get in on the fun. But that's not the case, and you want to be very disciplined when you make these determinations like, oh, the white king is going to be perpetual checked. You want to make sure that you're accurate, because here there's a very straightforward and, although it might not be so intuitive, there is indeed a way for the white king to escape. So don't be afraid to allow many checks to commence, because sometimes that's the only way for you to make progress. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you're new around here. Like the video if you did learn something new from it. I'll see you next time. Peace out.